I could have kept going with the Beatitudes, but I thought these two were enough for us to focus on today. I've always had this sense that, or attraction or emphasis on the Sermon on the Mount and on the upper room discourse in the Gospel of John. Both of them seem special in the midst of all of Jesus' teaching and guidance and instruction throughout the Gospels. It seems like choosing to begin his public ministry and that the first things that he would say in the Sermon on the Mount seem to have some special meaning, and the last things that he would say to his followers in the upper room seem to have some special meaning, that there's some primacy to these words because they are Jesus' choice for uncovering the way that he's going to teach and the way that he's going to help us understand how he looks at the world or how he looks at the life of faith. I don't know if the words kind of worldview or philosophy of life or meta-narrative mean anything to you. This idea that there's a kind of basic way of looking at the world or of understanding the world, a central posture that we have. But I think that the kinds of things that Jesus is sharing with us, the reason that the Beatitudes and the Sermon on the Mount have been so compelling and have captured so much of the church's attention for so many years, is because we understand that something about this way of thinking that Jesus is sharing is exposing his core concept, his core way of instructing us to understand the world the way that he does, to understand the life of faith the way that he does. And one of the things that Jesus always does over and over again, both in the ways he chooses to teach us, like using parables or using paradoxes, but also in the very things he says, one of the things Jesus always chooses to do is, as Betsy was saying, confront the basic assumptions of how people view life and to challenge the dominant worldview. So the dominant worldview that we encounter over and over again is that, we should be happy. That in America, in a place like this, that we should be rich, that we should be comfortable, that we should get life on our terms. Right? That's the dominant worldview. Jesus' worldview is different. The Christo worldview is that, you should be blessed. That you should be a blessing. You should love. I think what's wonderful about the Beatitudes in particular is that all of these things that we are inclined to avoid being, meek and in mourning, persecuted, and Jesus says it is actually through these very things that you can see the life of faith in the way that I see the life of faith. It's an invitation. I don't know that it's normal for us or regular for us. Even those of us who are people of faith, who have come up in the church all of our lives, who want to be looking at life through the lens of Jesus' eyes, it's not very normal for us to choose Christ's worldview. Our default is probably the world's. And I'd invite you to, just as I get started, to just pause and consider the accuracy of that statement in your own life. Isn't it true that most of us would choose first a dominant worldview? What do we want for ourselves? What do we want for our children? To be happy, right? To be comfortable, to be safe, to be successful, to be in control of our own destiny. If you examine your own motivations every day when you get out of bed, does that seem to ring true for you too? most days, the world cooperates with us. Most days, the world says, okay, if that's the life that you want to chase, go for it. And at the end of the day, of course, you're going to have had obstacles along the way. But for the kind of folks that we are sitting in this beautiful space, we're kind of the dominant populations in the country for the most part. We can live the dominant worldview kind of life that we want to live most days. The challenge comes on those days that don't work. The big ugly days that we remember for the rest of our lives, where we find that the dominant worldview that is easy and regular is insufficient. Today I want to flesh out how God uses those kinds of days, how God uses creatively the difficulties that we face in our lives to kind of move us a little bit, to help us have a greater appetite for Christ's way of looking at the world. But before I do that, I want to talk a little bit more about how I think we operate, just usually, on an existential level. And by existential, I mean identity, like in terms of how we think of ourselves and how we relate to the world around us, and then how grief operates in our lives. Because I have come to learn that y'all are living with some of that around here right now. How many people in this room own a home? Anybody brave enough to tell me, what is owning a home, what's the most regular aspect of being a homeowner? What's it like to own a home? Are you not a talk-back kind of church? What was that? A mortgage? Money? There's always money to spend. There's always something. What was that? Oh, the security of owning a home, so financially, right? Safe space, a place that's yours. Maintenance. Yep. So my favorite room in our house is the front room. It's south-facing, big windows. It's the room with my reading chair. It's the room where our instruments are, so the guitars and things are in that room, and the kids practice piano in there. In that room, there's a Craftsman buffet that was my wife's grandma's, and she is a saint in our family. And before she died, she made it real clear that we were supposed to get that buffet because she knew that I was a woodworker and she knew I admired it and she liked me better than anybody else. In that room, I can sit and see the things that are valuable to our family. Time that we're together and that we've wrestled. That has the best open space for wrestling. It's the place where we make music together. It's the place where we relax together. It's also, like every other room in the house, a space where I could sit down with my wife and say, what do you think of this room? And it wouldn't be long before I had a list of 5 things that could be better. The carpet is itchy. The walls are the same color as they were when we bought the house, which is this kind of baby blue that you really don't like. And that's another part of owning a home, that there's always something. We know that at any time our furnace could go out. At any time our roof could have given up the ghost and need to be replaced. And there's always this running list of things to do. And that's normal. We also know that there could be a hailstorm, that there could be a chimney fire, that a tree could collapse and fall on the deck. I share all this to say, I think that analogy that I often will use when I think about the self, because hospital chaplaincy is largely about meeting people at moments in their lives where things are kind of up for grabs, where there's big changes happening that they have to adjust to in terms of who they are as a person and the most important relationships in their lives. And often I'll think about the analogy of a house as an analogy about who we are. Because just like if you own a house and it's full of the spaces and the items from your life that are meaningful to you, that feel the most like home, that make you feel the most secure, it's also a place that constantly demands your attention. And I think that we are that way as people, that we're constantly kind of investing in our own selves. And I don't mean in just the daily stuff of life, I mean in our identities, kind of who we are. That we're always kind of tinkering with that stuff. I'm not of the school of mind that who you are is only inherited. I think it is mostly beyond our control to change who we are, but we're still always working on it on a conscious and unconscious level. And a lot of times it's just the regular stuff, you know, your job changes or your relationships kind of ebb and flow. But every once in a while in our lives, something big happens. There's a house fire. And there's total devastation in the house that is ourself. And the greater the threat, the more work it takes afterwards to recover. And I'm talking now about loss. I'm talking about the things in our lives that happen that are unwelcome and threaten us directly or threaten someone who's so important to us that they might as well be us. You know, this is not a conception that I really understood until I became a parent. In Barack Obama's interview with Letterman on this Letterman's new talk show, he talked about his daughters, and he talked about what it's like to have your hearts living outside your body. And that's, you know, my mind was expanded when I became a dad and realized that who I am doesn't really have much to do about me and what's going on inside me. It's the people that are the most important to me that determine who I am and how well I can be and how much I can operate effectively in this world and happily. But when life throws something at us that threatens us significantly, it forces us to really adapt, really reconsider who we are and how we can live in this world when the people that we love are injured or lost to us. These words from researchers Marwitt and Matthew maybe get at what I'm trying to say here. The assumption that I will grow old with my significant other, that my children will die after me, that people are decent and generally kind, that God is a protector, or that I will have a healthy future, give a clear prediction of the way things are, or at least should be. In this way, our life experiences lead us to assume that the world is generally predictable. So when I talk about this analogy of the house, that's kind of what I'm talking about. We have all of these ideas about how life is supposed to go, and I think it's some of that dominant worldview stuff I was talking about earlier. And those are our assumptions. And we build this set of assumptions, this assumptive world, and it helps us to get out of bed in the morning. You know, it helps us to get in the car and drive and not be terrified that something horrible is going to happen to us today, and not be paralyzed with the fears that something horrible might happen to the people we love, because nothing did yesterday, right? And nothing did the day before that. And so we live in these assumptions. And that's what helps us to operate as people, is this collection of assumptions that we have that help us to predict how each day is going to go. And then when we encounter really devastating losses, that knocks our assumptive world to pieces. And that's how I think grief often works in our lives. The reason that people talk about intense grief in such profound and debilitating ways is not only because we love people who we need to live without. It's because when we love people and have to live without them, or when we lose a job that meant everything to us, or when we receive a significant health diagnosis that's going to change the direction our lives is going in, it's not just pragmatic. It challenges who we are and how we think the world is supposed to work. And it can be paralyzing. You see people who are in the acute phases of grief just kind of walking around numb, like they don't know how to operate anymore. Because that's what grief does to us, and that's what loss does to us. Now, and this is the point that I would really encourage you to think about as a congregation and as individuals, in terms of the way that God works in our lives when we encounter difficulty. One of the myths of American grief, the way that we think that grief works, is the myth of resilience. When they test resilience of a physical object in like a physics laboratory, what they have this machine that they will load some material into, and then they have a pendulum that they drop that hammers into the object. And it measures two different things. It measures the degree to which the object is able to return the force that's put at it, meaning how much the pendulum bounces. And it also measures the degree to which the object is able to absorb the impact. So a very resilient physical object is an object that can absorb impact, return force, and return to its original condition. So for instance, a rubber ball would be very resilient, right? Because it can take the force, give it back, and then it's a rubber ball again. A piece of concrete, though it might seem resilient because it's hard to break, is not resilient because it doesn't give it all, and it just breaks with enough force. And we kind of think that we ought to be that way. When we talk about resiliency, we think that we ought to be able to experience some trying event and then return back to our original condition. Right? Is that true that if you think about bouncing back, that we really think about kind of staying the way we were before we experienced the adverse event? But that's not the way grief works. Right? When we talk about grief, we talk about it changing people. And in the hospital, when we're working with people and we see people experience significant loss, we hope that in the long run, that they'll be able to grow into that loss, not that they'll just be the people that they were before it happened. We talk about grief being integrated into our lives. And this is why I want to think about the way that God operates. When Jesus says, "Blessed are those who mourn because they will be comforted," Jesus isn't interested in people coming back into the condition that they were in, living in that kind of dominant worldview before they experienced some difficulty in their lives. That's not the way that God works throughout Scripture. Right? You hear about God's style being the style of redemption or recreation or renaming. Jesus says things like, "The first shall be last." And we hear stories of people like Saul becoming the Apostle Paul, or Jesus saying, "Can I breathe into these dry bones and give them life?" Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Psalm 34:18 says, "The Lord is close to the brokenhearted and saves those who are crushed in spirit." I think my motivation in taking you down this kind of conceptual pathway for how grief works is to invite you to think corporately as a church that I understand has, in the past few months, not just had a lot of losses, but had some losses that are kind of community core. Some people who not only are they pillars to the operation of the church, but for many of you, to your heart connection here. That when you're in a community of faith like this, that can barely catch your breath after one loss before the next one comes, that simply knowing how to tolerate the feelings is not enough. We need to hear from God in these settings, in these moments. We need to know that God is up to something. And I'd like to remind you this morning that this is exactly the kind of material that God works with. That God doesn't historically and through Scripture tend to do much with us when things are normal and predictable and easy. That those are kind of status quo times. Those aren't redemption times. Those aren't growth times. But that the time you're in right now, it may be. It may be a time where hearts are tenderized. And not only do you need to hear the voice of God to kind of call you back to a sense of self, but maybe the voice of God is going to be inviting you to a different place in the midst of your sadness and struggle. Constructivist theories for coping, which is kind of the philosophy that I gravitate toward, suggest that grief is useful in our lives when several tasks can be accomplished. First, when we can make sense, meaning when we experience a significant loss or significant losses, it challenges our assumptions about the way things are supposed to be, about what our community is supposed to look like and who's supposed to be there when we show up in the morning. One of the things we have to do to incorporate the grief experience and to incorporate loss is to make sense out of that, to be able to have new assumptions when the old assumptions have failed. Another is benefit finding, and this is a very difficult thing to say to people whose hearts are aching, or to say to yourself when your heart is aching, or to put it another way, it's positive reappraisal. It's when you're able to say, as I've worked primarily in a pediatric setting at Blank Children's Hospital, and I've talked to a lot of parents who have experienced losses. And when they're on our parent advisory board years later, and they're able to say things like, I'm really a much more compassionate person than I used to be. I'm much more likely to cry at commercials, or I'm much more likely to offer to help someone because of what Emma has given to me, what their child's loss has given to them. So that's an example of benefit finding, meaning this experience has done something to me. And that's the third one, is an identity change. The people who I see years down the road who are thriving in the midst of their loss are often those people who become really passionate about organ and tissue donation, right? Or who get very involved as boosters for the school that their kids went to, or have found a sense of mission because of the difficulty in their lives. And I think that a church is a really great place to observe yourselves in the midst of a season of loss and sadness, to observe yourselves and see what God is doing. Alan Wolfelt is a really great grief theorist and trainer. And he says that mourning presents us with 6 needs. 1 is that we acknowledge a new reality. 2 is that we embrace the pain of loss. 3 is that we remember the person who has died. 4 is that we develop a new self-identity. 5 is that we search for meaning. And 6 is that we receive ongoing support. I think about the context of a church and what those things might look like in a community of faith. A room full of people who, to the one, I'm sure you would say, I'm not really comfortable receiving help. I'd much rather be the person who offers it. What might it look like if, in this time of reassessing who you are in the absence of some people who are beloved, you learn to receive from each other differently? What might it look like if, as you come through these doors, not only do you feel the absence of people, but you talk about it together? You remember those people. You say, what were these people to our church, and how now can I be this person to our church? And what might it look like if you open yourselves to the possibility that every time that our heart aches and heart breaks, not only is it one of the curses of living in a broken world, but also by God's way of doing things, one of the potentials for blessing. One of the times where we might actually set aside the dominant approach to the world, set aside our normal daily practice of wanting to be happy and wanting things to be under our control and wanting things to go according to our plan. We can set that aside and actually want to hear God speak to us with the voice of a divine parent and call us back to ourselves and comfort us and invite us to step into a new place. I pray that that is your experience as a church, and that in the times where absence and ache are the most profound, that there are also the times that you are the most available to the love and grace of God. Amen.